Let's now load some data into a React application for the very first time. However, in this lecture, let's start by doing it the wrong way, basically, which is going to be a great learning experience. So in this section, we are going to go back to our Use Popcorn application that we have been working on before. And so let's now grab the project folder and open it back up in VS Code. All right. Now here, let's start by actually duplicating this file. And then I'm going to rename one of them to app version 1. And so by doing this, we are not going to overwrite the code that we have written before. And so you can keep it as a reference. Now, as we have learned before in the previous section, we should never update state in render logic, right? But now in this lecture, let's actually break that rule so that we can see why it actually exists in the first place. And breaking rules like this is actually a pretty great way of learning React and also its rules even better. Now the idea here is to fetch some movie data as soon as the app component here mounts for the very first time. So as soon as it has its initial render. So to fetch that data, we use the OMDB API, which is basically like an open version of IMDb. Now to get started, you need to get your own API key, which you can get for free just by clicking here and then filling out this form. And so immediately you will then get your free API key. And then once you have that, you can just come back here to the main page so we can see how we can use this API. So our data requests should simply be sent to this URL. So just copy that. And then here, let's fetch the data using the fetch API. So using the fetch function like this. All right. Now, in case you're not familiar with the fetch function and on how to work with asynchronous JavaScript, then please go back to the beginning of the course and take a look at the JavaScript review section, where I talk about all that in great length. But anyway, here now, of course, you need to place your own key. And actually, I want to do this. So I want to place this key in a separate variable. So let's define that out here. So key. And by now, after that long previous section, you know why we should actually define a variable like this outside the component function. And the reason for that is that each time the component gets re-rendered, this entire function here will be executed again. So basically all the render logic. And so if this variable definition here is part of that render logic, it will also be recreated each time that the component renders, which is in this case, of course, not a big deal, but it's good to already get into the habit of not doing that. So when you're just defining a variable like this, that doesn't depend on anything that's inside the component, then just declare it outside. Now I'm just getting my own API key, but of course you should use your own one here. And now let's go back to the documentation page where we can see that we can query the API in two ways. So we can search for an ID or a title, or we can actually search by some query string. And so that's actually what we will do here. So here, let's use s and then equal, and then here you can type your favorite movie, which for me probably is Interstellar. Not 100% sure of that, but it's definitely a great one. Okay, but anyway, now we need to handle the promise that the fetch function here returns inside, and of course here it's then, so inside a then method, which gets access to the response, and then here we can convert that response to JSON immediately, which will return another promise. And so we chain on another then, and then here we get access to the data, which we can then, for now, log to the console. And for now, that's actually it. So let's see what we get here. Or of course, we first need to actually start our application. So make sure you are in the right project folder here and then type npm start. So that should then open up the new tab here. And indeed, there it is. So let's check out our console and let's just reload quickly. And indeed, you see that React was able to fetch the data from the API. So we are just interested in the search here. And so all the movies here are in fact about Interstellar, which means that our query here is already working. Now, as we learned in the previous section, this data fetching that we're doing right here is actually introducing a side effect into the component's render logic. So it is clearly an interaction with the outside world, which should never be allowed in render logic. So again, all this code that is here at the top level of the function is of course code that will run as the component first mounts, and therefore it is called render logic. And so again, here we should have no side effects. I mean, in this example where we only log something to the console, it actually appears to work just fine. But watch what happens if we set some state here. And to do that, let's actually first get rid of our temporary data here. So this movie data and watched data, we only used like as a template for the previous section, but now let's get rid of that. And so as I was just saying, let's now here actually set state. So that list of movies that we get from the API, we now want to get it into our movie state. And so that's at data.search. Give it a save, and beautiful. So we got some data from the API now showing up in our UI. But watch what happens when we check out the network tab. So you see that it's basically running an infinite number of requests here. So it keeps going and it never really stops. So every second our app is firing off multiple fetch requests to this API, which of course is a really, really bad idea. So why do you think that is? Why do you think all these fetch requests are being fired off? Well, the reason is that setting the state here in the render logic will then immediately cause the component to re-render itself again. So that's just how state works, right? However, as the component is re-rendered, the function here, of course, is executed again, which then will fetch again, which in turn will set the movies again as well. And then this whole thing starts over and over again. So as the state is dead, the component is re-rendered again, which then will fetch again, which will set the movies again. And so this really is an infinite loop of state setting and then the component re-rendering. And so this is the reason why it is really not allowed to set state in render logic. So let's quickly set this back here so that we don't have like a million requests here. And so as we reload, then it stops. And let's just see another example here quickly. So let's say we did set watched immediately here in the top level code to some empty array. And then actually we do get a real error. I mean, let's reload that. And yeah, here we are now reloading all the time again the data from the API. But what matters here is that we get the error of too many re-renders. And so that's now because of this state setting right here. So if we're really setting the state here in the top level, even without being inside a then handler, then immediately React will complain that there are too many renders, which means that we again entered that infinite loop where updating state will cause the component to re-render, which will cause the state to be set, and so on into infinity. So let's of course get rid of that. Let's reload here. And so now we are again good. However, we do actually want to set the state here. So we do want set movies here, but without all the problems that we just saw. And so how can we do that? Well, that's where we need the useEffect hook, which we will learn about in the next lecture.